Hey everyone, I know I've been away for a while, apologies for that, work's just been very crazy. That said, I'm starting to play some catch up and wanted to make a What We Learned video for Revelations of Dust. Don't worry, I'll have another one for some of the other events that have come out in the most recent time as well. Now, I will say this event brought a lot of newer things and more questions for us, but also brought more things to light as well. I did thoroughly enjoy this event as it did give a pretty decent dive more into the Iris Orthodoxy before the Iris and Vitya split, giving us a bit more background on this much smaller faction. That said, let's dive into what we can say we learned in this event. First up, I wanted to quickly go over one of the smaller points here about the Iris Orthodoxy's factions. For all the time that we've known the Iris Orthodoxy has been really just two groups. The Iris Libre, led by Richelieu, and the Vitya Dominion, led by Jean Bar. However, there's two additional groups that have been mentioned a good number of times in this event, and I think a few times in others. These groups are the Holy See and the Tribunal. The Tribunal, from what we can tell, is a third group within the Iris. They seem to be led by Lord Clemeno? I'm gonna butcher this if I keep trying to say. Anyway. There's not much else we can really say about them, sadly. But I'm curious how this group is particularly doing after the split. Are they loyal to one side or the other, or are they going to maintain a neutral stance? Can't really say for sure, but definitely curious to see where these groups are going to play out in the future. Moving on with more things around the Iris, the setting of this event, the four basilicas, and the catacombs have quite a history with the Iris. While we do know that it is an old Iris Orthodoxy facility with Siren tech, it's interesting to know that the Iris Orthodoxy had control of this island first during the first Siren War. It didn't even have Siren tech on it until after the Sirens defeated the Iris the first time and took it over. Of course, afterwards, the Iris Orthodoxy then beat them and took the island back. But what they did with the island afterwards was quite interesting, to say the least. Utilizing the pawn production system for amassing a large army was going to be a critical thing, especially after they had just mentioned that they paid a heavy price to take the island back. However, not everything was perfect with this system since, well, as Richelieu puts it, as they say, assembling an army is the easy part. Controlling it is where the difficulty really lies. We know the Sirens are able to control pawns easily with their more elite Siren models. We also know the chaos that follows when those same elite models are defeated in battle. Pawns just start acting all haywire. That said, the Iris not having this controller for their armies presented a bit of a problem. They did thankfully have a solution in the form of the Horsemen, but still ran into another issue they simply called infection. Now, the infected pawns would behave oddly, doing things that they probably weren't supposed to do, and well, even worse than that, they would spread the infection to other pawns, causing an outbreak, so to speak. One of the things I find particularly interesting about this infection is that we can somewhat match that behavior to the metaphenomenon. When afflicted, constant with the metaphenomenon act differently from what we're used to seeing. They may seem erratic, maybe even completely different from what we've known them to be like, or even do bizarre things like turn on their allies. As for the spreading aspect, we've seen Baumann Richard attempt something like this with Monarch and the other ship girls in Pledge of the Radiant Cord. Maybe this has something to do with the nature of both pawns and Consen as a whole. Well, we'll have to see. That said, the facility's use of the four horsemen is interesting as well. The four horsemen are part of the Book of Revelations, which, in a short term, is pretty much just doomsday writing. This would definitely feel a bit out of left field, but this facility was tasked with eschatology, or the study of the end of the world, or mankind. Now, eschatology seems like an odd thing for this current era we're in. Aside from a certain crazy Essex-class carrier that is obsessed with hermit crabs, there's not any major threat on the horizon, it seems. So, why this? Well, as mentioned before, this facility was up during the old days of the First Siren War. Now, we don't have a lot of information on the First Siren War ourselves, but thankfully the first anniversary art book can help us a bit here. But with the invasion of the Sirens, control of 90% of the world's sea was lost. Ships were sunk, sea routes cut off, and the human sphere of life that had once spread across the world shrunk back to the continents. and eventually to islands. Humanity had become caged off. With the economy hurt from the destruction of international trade, socio-political unrest due to the frequent military defeats, and national power declining from the drawn-out war, humanity's standard of living saw a steep decline. Considering how dire things were in the first Siren War, this really doesn't feel that weird to have research on. However, I think the four Horsemen were a lot more dangerous than I think the Vitsha Dominion and maybe even the Iris Orthodoxy themselves realized. As they continued to produce pawns, the Horsemen would get stronger and stronger. Had Implacable Richelou's group not stopped at this facility, the four superweapons could eventually find a way to break free and, well, likely destroy the world, as La Galicianaire meta mentions. Now, before we dive more into the Horsemen and even religion, I want to talk about the Mirror Sea that was the Catacombs for a bit here. Most Mirror Seas we've seen are rather simple, mostly causing local disruptions and sometimes even spatial or weather anomalies. However, this Mirror Sea had a very unique set of rules with it in the form of concepts. The Horsemen's traits, prayer, and things in the environment were all focused around these particular rules. If Richelieu, Implacable, and the rest of the group wanted to get out of this Mirror Sea, they would also have to abide by them as well. Now, this is not the first time that a Mirror Sea has had a unique set of rules to them, as we can point to the one used by Musashi, Nagato, Mikasa, and Akagi for their game. This does stand to ask, are Mirror Seas able to be configured this way? If that's the case, how was the Iris's one configured? For what dialogue we can gather, the Iris had no control of this Mirror Sea. They couldn't even find the control unit for it either. If they had no way to control it, who did? The missing control unit isn't the first time this has happened either. In Mirror Involution, the Mirror Sea that the Commander, San Francisco, Helena, and Archerfish were in had its unit hidden as well. The only reason we know of this is because Yorktown Meta found it and took care of it. A fact we only learn of from her talking with Helena Meta at the end of the event. However, the Mirror Sea Richelieu and Implacable's team were in had only one known meta there at the time, La Galicianaire Meta. La Galicianaire Meta says that it's likely the Siren's doing, and well, that wouldn't be impossible, but it seems rather odd that the Sirens didn't bother to intervene if this was their doing. With a time bomb as deadly as this that the world was sitting on, you'd think they'd do something about it. I don't think the destruction of this world is their particular end goal, even with how dire things were in the first Siren War. So I guess in this case, it really just leaves even more questions for us at this point. The focus on religion and ideals in this event was interesting with the Horsemen as well. With how the Mirror Sea worked, it's not really that surprising that the Horsemen of War was the best in fighting since, well, as war. Even if the Horsemen of Death had the larger army, war did as war does best. Now, even though the Horsemen were supposedly stronger than the Consent, they could still be outmatched if the Consent invoked the power of prayer as they did at the end. We did get to see what happened if the Consent tried to evoke the concepts of the Horsemen, and well, I'm kind of glad that this meme is now canon, but for very different reasons. Anyway, the prayer part was also pretty unique as well, since the power of faith played into the concepts of this particular Mirror Sea. With how Richelieu had such an easy time with it, I had thought that she'd be the only one able to utilize this, but, well, as Implacable states, there's no way for me to invoke the concept of a faith I do not hold, but I just had an idea. If faith is the concept that governs the space, it should not matter if we have faith in the same thing, right? If there's anything you should know about the Royal Navy, it's that we have an unshakable faith in one person. The fact that this worked showed that it doesn't really matter if it's Irish Orthodoxy or not. It was just faith. Now, I do feel faith isn't something new to us as a whole, though we may not necessarily realize this. If we consider the Consent, about how they are considered the wishes and hopes of humanity, or how the ritual around Watatsumi wishes ships like Shinano into existence after a ritual, that faith in Consent could be seen in a similar way. In a way, the Consent were called by humanity, and the faith that they have in them. Now, faith in religion in this sense could have a lot of impact in other things outside of this Mirror Sea. What's particularly fascinating in this, though, is how Implacable was able to call Queen Elizabeth Meta. even to the shock of Queen Elizabeth Meta herself. This means that the system somehow knew how to connect the two to each other. So the bigger question here is, how is it able to do that? And how is a concept like faith able to do something at that scale? Moving on to the final bits, there's a small scene with Sheffield Meta and Hunter Meta. They are tasked with pursuing a whale for a certain Miss D. While it's not confirmed who is who in this particular situation, we could take a guess with what we do know. The D could very much stand for Dreamweaver, an alias that Observer Zero sometimes goes by, or Dreamweaver if the typo is still a thing. If this were the case, then the whale is likely Enterprise Meta or Ash. The Sirens have been trying to locate her for a considerable amount of time, but have seen pretty much no success at all. So this scene could simply be showing that even more characters are involved in this hunt. Now, how could we tie these two together? Well, this is possibly a coincidence, maybe not, but let's go back a couple of years to 2019, when Ashen Simulacrum was running. The very last dialogue scene of that particular event has a part where Observer Zero starts talking about the fabled whale Moby Dick, saying at one point they will find it, else the story never ends. Outside of that, there's not a whole lot of other possibilities currently. The last thing I want to mention here is with Ulrich. Ulrich had pretty much nothing to do with this event. She had no role in it whatsoever, yet somehow she had this dream. Just like Richelieu and Implacable. I know that the fortress she's supposed to be at is somewhere close to the island where this takes place, but how does she have this dream? Normally mirror seas affect things in the nearby vicinity of itself. Ulrich having this dream seems unusual and uncharacteristic at this time. The implications for this could be that the island's mirror sea and its influence is capable of going beyond what we know mirror seas to do. This could even explain how Queen Elizabeth Meta was able to be called. What makes this particular mirror sea so special? Or are other mirror seas able to do this as well? Last but not least, there is one discrepancy I wanted to quickly clarify. It's mostly just Prelude items. There is a point in the Prelude where Ian's Queen Elizabeth says the particular following. I've contacted the commander to hopefully get them to stop. None of us can afford to make any rash moves while we don't know what we're up against. In this context, she's talking about ceasing all singularity activity to avoid the possibility of leading Bomb Richard to their particular branch. In Ian, she says it this way, implying the commander has some control over the Ironblood. In Cian, however, she mentions that she herself contacted the Ironblood instead of the commander. For the Cian side of things, the commander didn't have any involvement in this event whatsoever, despite the few references that Ian has. Cian never mentioned him in this event, so I'm not really sure how the commander's role was in this as a whole, if he even had one to begin with. Anyway, that is all I have for this particular lore video. I hope you guys all enjoyed this, and that it does give a bit of clarity to this particular event. As usual, I'll try to keep track of comments on this video and answer any questions that do pop up. So if you do have one, feel free to leave it down in the comments below. Apologies for the long delay of content. Work's just been absolutely devastating the last couple of weeks, and I really didn't have much time to address it to you all here. My schedule, however, is starting to clear up, so I should definitely be able to get more content out for you guys. And I do plan to be working on one for the more recent event that came, well, not really recent, for the Russian event that came not too long ago. So don't worry, there'll be a video for that one as well. That said, I hope you guys did enjoy this, and I will see you guys all in the near future. Thanks for watching. See you guys soon.